Evelyn Carter had always believed that silence held its own language, one that only a few learned to hear. At 72, her world was made up of quiet mornings, the soft hum of bees drifting over rosemary, and the gentle creak of the porch swing where her husband, Henry, once read the Sunday paper. She lived alone now, in the same weathered farmhouse just outside Ashfield, Oregon, nestled among whispering pines and the scent of damp earth. Henry had been gone for over a year. A stroke, swift and merciless, had stolen him one Tuesday afternoon as he was tending to the gutters. No final words, no hand to hold in parting. One moment he was there, planting the spring bulbs. The next, Evelyn was staring at his boots on the porch and the trowel he never returned to the shed. They'd lived in that house for 45 years. Evelyn still remembered the first time she saw it. Nothing more than a tired frame leaning eastward, surrounded by wild grass and sky. Henry had called it God's blank canvas, and convinced her to believe in it too. They had little more than youthful defiance and a few $100s, but they poured everything they had into that land. He rebuilt the home one beam at a time, carving their initials into the back porch railing with a penknife. Evelyn, with hands more used to chalk and books, planted her first tomatoes in the broken earth behind the house and a single, stubborn sunflower that refused to die. She had been a schoolteacher for nearly 30 years, the kind of woman who spoke softly but left an impression that lingered. Children adored her because she remembered small things, their birthdays, their favorite colors, their fears about thunderstorms. But in her own life, she was simple, steady. Her happiness bloomed slowly, quietly, like the marigolds she lined along the fence every June. After retirement, she and Henry spent their days nurturing the garden that had grown with them. Every season added something new: zinnias for their daughter's wedding, tulips after the miscarriage, basil for Sunday sauces, and rosemary for memory. Evelyn knew each plant the way a mother knows her children, not just by name, but by their temperament, their needs, their secret beauty. Then came the silence. Not just in sound, but in essence. The silence that arrived after Henry passed was so vast, it seemed to fill every room. It lived in his empty mug on the windowsill, in the drawer where he kept mismatched socks, in the dent on his side of the bed that refused to smooth out. Evelyn would often find herself whispering into that silence, not expecting answers, only needing to fill the void. And when the loneliness clawed at her ribs too hard, she'd go to the garden. There, kneeling in the dirt, she remembered how to breathe again. Her garden became her church, her sanctuary. She prayed there more than she did in the chapel downtown. With her hands in the soil, she felt closer to Henry, to something divine. Sometimes, she swore she could hear his voice in the rustle of the wind through the cornflowers. Other times, she'd sit for hours beside the lavender beds, where they used to sit together and sip sweet tea, her hands wrapped around warm mugs, his calloused fingers brushing dirt from her cheek. Every inch of that garden held a memory. There was the patch near the peach tree where Henry had first danced with her under the moonlight, barefoot and laughing like a boy. The corner of the herb bed where their son, Lucas, once buried his broken toy truck, declaring it a sacred treasure. The row of peonies she planted after her diagnosis scare. For life, Henry had said, pressing the bulbs into her hand with tears in his eyes. But perhaps most sacred of all were the roses. They were Henry's idea, planted for their 30th anniversary. "Because you bloom better than any flower I've ever seen," he told her, face flushed like a teenager. They were deep red, fragrant, and resilient, just like Evelyn. She tended them with devotion, pruning and coaxing them back each season. Even when her back ached and the arthritis flared, she refused to let anyone else touch them. Mornings were Evelyn's favorite. She'd rise before the sun, brew her coffee the way Henry liked it, strong enough to kick a mule, he'd joke, and wander barefoot into the garden. The grass was cool, the air sweet with dew, and for a few brief moments, it was as though the world hadn't moved on without him. She talked to him then, out loud sometimes, recounting her dreams or laughing at how the grandkids had grown. It didn't matter that no one answered. What mattered was the speaking, the remembering. Her children visited less over the years. Lucas was always busy, and her daughter-in-law, Isabella, was full of polite smiles and hurried glances at her phone. Evelyn tried not to mind. People had their lives. But part of her longed for someone to see it the way she did. Not the house or the land, but what lived inside it. One day, Evelyn was pulling weeds by the garden's edge when she uncovered an old metal tag, one they had used years ago to mark the snapdragons. It was rusted, barely legible, but in Henry's handwriting it still read, "For Evelyn, always blooming." Her breath caught. The moment hit her like a hymn, one she hadn't sung in decades. She held it in her palm and cried, not from grief, but from gratitude. Later that night, she sat on the porch with the tag beside her and stared out across the twilight garden. The sun dipped low, painting everything in gold. For the first time in months, Evelyn didn't feel alone. She looked toward the roses, thick with bloom and shadow, and remembered something Henry once said during a thunderstorm that had knocked out the power for 3 days. Even when the lights go out, Evie, we still have roots. She hadn't understood then. She did now. And in that moment of stillness, of cracked path and crushed roses, of empty chairs and full hearts, Evelyn Carter made a silent promise. She would protect this soil, this memory. Not for nostalgia. Not for sentiment. But for love. The kind you plant with your hands and fight to keep alive, even when the world tells you it's just dirt. It started with a phone call Evelyn had been half expecting, the kind you sense coming like distant thunder. Lucas's voice was quiet but strained, the words tumbling faster than usual, wrapped in apologies and hesitation. "Mom, we're in a bit of a tight spot," he said. "Just for a while. A few months at most." She didn't ask for the details. She never did. He was her son. That was enough. "Of course," she answered. "Come home." The word had meant something once. Walls Henry built with his bare hands. The porch where Evelyn had taught the grandkids to shuck corn. The garden, with its orderly beds and bursts of color, so alive, it felt like the very heartbeat of the land. Home had always been more than a roof to Evelyn. It was where love had put down roots. They arrived 2 weeks later, in a flurry of cardboard boxes, plastic toys, and the weary air of people who'd been running too long. Isabella kissed Evelyn's cheek quickly and disappeared into the kitchen with a Bluetooth earpiece and a laptop. The kids, Liam, Sophie, and baby Nora, tumbled into the house like puppies, leaving sneakers and questions in their wake. For a while, Evelyn reveled in the noise. After years of silence and only her own breathing for company, the clatter of little feet and the sharp laughter of children felt like music. She made pancakes shaped like bears, taught Sophie how to pull weeds from the root, and let Liam splash her with the garden hose. The first few weeks were a kind of golden chaos. Then came the changes, small, sharp, and constant, like being nibbled to death by ducks. The hose stopped working. No one fixed it. Isabella rearranged Evelyn's kitchen, then the pantry, then the shed. Bikes were left blocking the garden path. Joel built a fire pit dangerously close to the greenhouse and shrugged when she objected. "It's just a garden, Mom," he said. No one asked. They just did. The calm in Evelyn began to fray at the edges. Still, she told herself this was what love looked like now, disorderly, loud, and full of movement. It was enough, wasn't it? To have them near. To not be alone. She said nothing when Isabella moved her teacups to a new shelf. Bit her tongue when Lucas set up an extension cord through the flower bed, just for the weekend. Ignored the sting when Sophie referred to the herb patch as our new playground. Then one afternoon, everything changed. It was a warm Saturday, the kind of day when bees doze on lavender and the light falls soft through the maple trees. Evelyn had just finished watering the marigolds, her knees aching pleasantly, when she turned the corner toward the rose bed and froze. The air left her lungs like a punch. There, in the middle of the once sacred rose garden, stood a bright plastic swing set, red and yellow, bolted crudely into the soil. Its legs were anchored with poured concrete, and the roses, her roses, were gone. All of them. Uprooted. Scattered. Torn apart. A shallow trench remained where Henry's commemorative anniversary bush had stood for over a decade. The engraved stone he'd placed beside it, etched with the words, "For Evelyn, my forever bloom," now lay face down in the dirt. Sophie swung joyfully, her small legs kicking skyward, while Liam cheered from a makeshift fort built out of Evelyn's overturned gardening baskets. Evelyn stood there in her sun hat and gloves, a trowel still in hand, unable to move. Her breath was shallow. Her knees buckled, not from age but from grief. That garden bed had been planted with tears and laughter. It had survived storms and seasons, been pruned back and regrown with care. It was where Henry had proposed, on a whim, muddy-kneed and grinning, and where Evelyn had once sat with baby Lucas asleep in her lap, whispering lullabies into the petals. Now it was mulch and bolts and Walmart-colored plastic. "Hope you don't mind," Isabella called, appearing on the porch with a cup of kombucha. The kids needed a spot to play, and this area wasn't really being used. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came. She simply nodded once and turned back toward the house, her boots sinking into the soft, shredded earth. Inside, she leaned against the counter, her breath hitching. A teacup, one of the old ones Henry had bought at a yard sale their first summer, sat on the windowsill, cracked but intact. She reached for it but stopped short, fingers trembling. That night, Evelyn didn't cook dinner. She sat in Henry's old armchair, wrapped in his faded flannel shirt, and stared out the window at the place where her roses had once bloomed. They hadn't just taken space. They had taken memory. They had taken love. And the worst part? No one even looked up. The next morning, Evelyn rose before dawn, long before the noise of children and the hum of Isabella's laptop began again. She padded barefoot to the garden, where dew still clung to the grass and the sky had not yet turned gold. She stood in front of the swing set, silent. The roses were crushed, the lilies were gone, only the cracked path remained. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried through the still air. She knelt and brushed the soil with her hand, fingers sifting through what had been sacred. She found the corner of the engraved stone, lifted it from the dirt, and held it close to her chest. A memory surfaced, clear and sudden. It had been their 30th anniversary. Evelyn came home from church to find Henry in the garden, his hands covered in dirt, his face shining with mischief. He had planted an entire bed of deep red roses, her favorite. She'd scolded him for doing it without her, and he'd said, "I wanted you to see what love looks like when it blooms without being asked." She hadn't understood fully then. She did now. But what she also knew now, more than ever, was that love didn't survive in a vacuum. Love, when ignored, shriveled. When taken for granted, it vanished. Her family had mistaken her silence for surrender. They didn't know that beneath her calm exterior was a root system as deep as any oak. She had grown this life, this home, this garden, and no one, not even the people she loved most, had the right to pave it over without asking. Evelyn didn't cry. She stood up slowly, tucked the stone under her arm, and walked back toward the house as the sun began to rise behind her, casting long shadows across the yard. In that moment, something hardened inside her, not bitterness, not yet, but resolve. She wasn't going to lose anything else. Not quietly. Not again. It was quiet in the kitchen that morning, the kind of soft silence that precedes a storm, though not the kind that comes with thunder. Evelyn Carter moved slowly, her movements rehearsed and steady, as she prepared Henry's favorite dessert, lemon pie with a butter crust and a hint of lavender from her garden. She zested the lemons by hand, her fingers still remembering how he liked it. Not too tart, just enough sweetness to make his eyes close in that contented way of his. It was her grandson Liam's birthday. He was turning 5. Isabella had planned a big party, balloons, barbecue, even one of those enormous inflatable bounce houses that took up half the backyard. Evelyn hadn't been consulted, but she didn't protest. She told herself this was what being a good mother, and now grandmother, meant, keeping the peace. Still, she baked the pie. Not because anyone asked, but because Henry would have wanted her to. As the crust cooled and the lemon filling thickened on the stove, Evelyn caught a sliver of conversation from the living room. Isabella's voice. Low clip. She was on the phone again, pacing near the window. Evelyn paused, one hand hovering over the mixing bowl. "Yes, I've seen the comps. If it were me, I'd sell the whole place and retire. This land is worth a fortune, just sitting here, wasted. She doesn't even need all of it. Honestly, I'm surprised it hasn't been listed already." There was a pause. A laugh. No, she has no clue. I'm just laying the groundwork. Once the garden's cleared, it'll be easier to talk numbers. Evelyn stood frozen, the wooden spoon slipping from her fingers and clattering to the counter. The lemon filling bubbled unattended, forgotten. She didn't confront Isabella, not then. Instead, she walked to the pantry, her knees trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. The wallpaper in the pantry was the same Henry had put up decades ago, small bluebells on a faded cream background. She focused on them, steadying her breath. They don't see you anymore, she thought. You're becoming furniture. Wallpaper. A formality in your own life. She went back to her pie. The party was loud, chaotic, and full of the kind of forced cheer Evelyn had grown used to. Joel was grilling steaks by the new fire pit, planted right over where her strawberry rose used to grow. Isabella handed out drinks in mason jars with twine bows, and the kids ran wild across the yard with juice boxes and frosting-smeared faces. Evelyn waited until the sun dipped low enough for shadows to soften. She changed into her good blouse, cream with embroidered violets along the collar, and carefully lifted the lemon pie onto her grandmother's serving dish. It was still warm, fragrant with citrus and sugar. She stepped out onto the porch, ready to call everyone for dessert. Then she saw it. The rose garden, not neglected, not wilted, gone. The entire bed had been cleared, flattened, the soil churned and leveled. Where once stood a riot of red, yellow, and blush pink blooms, roses Henry had planted for their anniversaries, birthdays, and quiet, just because, days, there was now only gravel. Pale gray and cold, with tire tracks already etched into the surface. A stack of lumber stood nearby. Someone had drawn a rough rectangle in the dirt with chalk. It wasn't just cleared. It had been claimed. And no one had told her. No one had asked. Evelyn stood at the edge of what used to be hers, clutching the pie dish like a relic. Her feet sank slightly into the softened soil where the cracked garden path once wove between hedges and lilies. The air was thick with barbecue smoke and laughter. Music spilled from a Bluetooth speaker on the porch, something poppy, synthetic, and utterly unfamiliar. Liam was unwrapping presents near the fire pit. Isabella was snapping photos. Joel was handing a beer to Mason. No one noticed her. No one saw her. And then the pie slipped. It tumbled from her hands, landing hard on the edge of the patio. The dish cracked in two with a clean snap, and the golden filling splattered across her shoes, across the gravel, across the grave of what had once been a garden built with love. She didn't gasp, didn't cry, didn't even curse. Just stood there, staring down at the wreckage of sweetness and porcelain. Not the single head turned. That night, after the guests had left and the fire pit died down to coals, Evelyn sat in the garden, what was left of it, with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The swing creaked in the breeze. A stray juice box lay crumpled in the basil bed. She picked it up with quiet dignity and dropped it into the trash. Then she walked to the edge of the gravel, her slippers crunching over the place where Henry's rosebush had stood. She knelt down, slowly, the stiffness in her knees aching more than usual. She pressed her palm into the soil. Cold. Lifeless. The roses were crushed. The lilies were gone. Only the cracked path remained. She remembered Henry's hands. Rough from work, always warm, always gentle with the plants. He used to say, "A garden's not just what you plant, it's what you protect." She had failed to protect it. Worse, she had handed them the shovel. Inside, she took the broken pie dish and placed it in the sink. One half had a chip missing, the jagged edge catching the light like a warning. She washed it carefully, set it on a towel to dry. Then she opened the drawer where she kept old seed catalogs, birthday cards from her students, and one small leather-bound notebook that Henry had given her on their 40th anniversary. She hadn't opened it in years. On the front, embossed in faded gold, were the words, "To Evelyn, for what you grow and what you guard." Inside were lists of plants, sketches of garden layouts, and little notes Henry had written about life. Page 12 read, "If you ever need to remember who you are, come here. This garden has always been your mirror." Evelyn closed the book and held it to her chest. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was remembering. Remembering how much she had given. How little was ever returned. How invisible she had allowed herself to become. But not anymore. The next morning, Evelyn made tea and wrote a name down on a yellow notepad. Nathan Finch, Property Law, Ashfield. She underlined it twice. Then she looked out the window at the gravel lot where her roses once grew. Not again, she whispered. Not one more inch. It was Hazel who answered the door before Evelyn even knocked. You look like someone's been peeling you back, one layer at a time, Hazel said, her silver braid falling over one shoulder like a rope of wisdom. Come and sit. I've got tea steeping and opinions boiling. Evelyn gave a tired smile and stepped into the kitchen that still smelled like cinnamon and soil. Hazel's house was old, but proudly so, worn floorboards, sun-faded curtains, and walls lined with snapshots of lives that had been lived out loud. It was familiar in a way Evelyn hadn't realized she'd been aching for. They sat at the small pine table they'd shared in their 20s, when they were just two girls with garden dreams and borrowed husbands. Hazel poured chamomile into mismatched cups, then leaned forward and waited. Evelyn hadn't come prepared to spill everything. But when she opened her mouth, it all poured out, words sharp and wet and aching. She told Hazel about Lucas and Isabella. About the gravel where the roses had been. About overhearing the phone call and dropping the lemon pie. About how every corner of her life had been slowly, expertly rearranged, until she wasn't sure where she belonged in her own home. Hazel didn't interrupt. Just listened. Her hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes steady. When Evelyn finally fell silent, Hazel leaned back with a sigh. You don't owe them this land, Evie. Evelyn blinked. What? You don't owe them this house. This dirt. This life you and Henry built with calluses and heart. Just because they came from your body doesn't mean they get to take what your soul still needs. They think they're helping. They're helping themselves. Hazel's voice was gentle but firm. And they're using your silence as permission. Evelyn looked down at her hands, wrinkled, veined, familiar. Once they'd planted a life. Now they trembled with hesitation. I don't even know what's still mine anymore. Hazel stood up and grabbed a cookie tin from a shelf. Inside wasn't baked goods but paperwork, deeds, old tax receipts, dusty envelopes. You ever go through your land records since Henry passed? No, Evelyn said slowly. He always handled that. Time you start. And you call someone who knows how to read between the lines. That night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table under the soft glow of the overhead bulb and pulled open the drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside were Henry's ledgers, their marriage certificate, folders labeled in his blocky handwriting. Taxes 2005 to 2019, garden layout, irrigation plans. She flipped through until she found a worn envelope marked, Parcel Division, 1998. She stared at it, her heartbeat suddenly audible. When she opened it, out fell a hand-drawn map and a copy of a land registry page. Her eyes scanned the page, every word shaky and blurred until one line came into focus. Lot B, 0.5 acres, registered under Evelyn Carter. The garden. The path from the old tool shed to the oak fence line. It was hers. Entirely. She sat very still for a long time. Then she reached for the phone. Nathan Finch looked too young to know anything about land rights, but his handshake was firm and his eyes kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. They met at Millie's Diner, a quiet place with sticky menus and chipped mugs. Evelyn slid the documents across the table and watched him read, pen tapping against his notebook. Mrs. Carter, he said, lifting his head. You still own this entire half-acre outright. It was separated from the main parcel by your husband 25 years ago, probably for agricultural reasons. That split makes it an independent property, legally. Evelyn blinked. Even with the house being under the family trust? Yes, ma'am. That part, house, barn, surrounding lot, belongs to the trust. But the garden lot? That's yours. No one can alter it, build on it, or sell it without your written consent. She exhaled, a shaky sound that wasn't quite relief, more like the gasp that comes right before a long, awaited breath. No one's filed any claims? She asked. No, he said. And frankly, they couldn't. Not unless you signed something. Did you? No, Evelyn said, clutching her purse tighter. They didn't even ask me. Nathan nodded and sat back. Then you're in control. Every legal right sits in your name. The table between them suddenly felt like a lifeboat. Driving home, Evelyn didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need music. Her thoughts were louder than any melody. For years, she had allowed herself to shrink, to soften, to yield. She had told herself that love meant compromise, that family meant sacrifice, that letting go of little pieces of herself was a part of growing older gracefully. But grace, she realized, shouldn't mean erasure. She pulled into the driveway and looked at the place where her garden used to be. The gravel lot still glared at her under the summer sun. The swing set squeaked in the wind. The laughter from the house didn't reach her this time. She stepped out of the car and stood on the boundary line. Her land. She could almost feel the heartbeat of the soil beneath her shoes. This place had been planted with love. Each rose, each time sprig, each memory like a bulb that bloomed and withered and bloomed again. It was hers. Henry had given her that land, not just with a pen and paper, but with every touch of his hand, every flower he planted in her name. She walked to the shed, opened it, and pulled out the old garden flag, the one with faded sunflowers and stitched words, "This is where our story grows." She dusted it off and staked it right at the edge of the gravel. Her story wasn't over. It was about to begin again. The day Evelyn met Clara and Miguel Langdon, it had just rained. Not a dramatic storm, just a soft, steady downpour that had left the air cool and the earth fragrant, like the sky had wept gently for the tired land below. She waited for them by the old fence, wearing her gardening hat and holding a clipboard that Nathan Finch had given her with the finalized property papers. She wasn't nervous. Not anymore. What she felt was quieter than that. Not excitement. Not sorrow. Something closer to resolve. Miguel was the first to arrive, stepping out of the dusty white pickup truck with a practiced gait, like someone who'd walked thousands of fields and never once complained. He wore boots coated in dry clay and a shirt with a stitched logo that read, "Soil Heals." Clara followed, her curly gray hair tied up under a sun hat and her eyes bright behind large, round glasses. She moved like someone who knew how to let the earth lead. Evelyn liked her instantly. "You must be Evelyn," Clara said, smiling as she extended her hand. "We can't thank you enough for letting us come." "You haven't seen it yet," Evelyn replied, though her voice was softer than the words. She opened the gate. "Come walk." They moved slowly through what was once her sanctuary. The gravel still covered most of the old rose bed, and the swing set squeaked in the breeze, abandoned since the party weeks ago. The lavender bushes had gone feral, stretching beyond their borders, reclaiming space in the most subtle form of rebellion. But Clara knelt in the dirt beside them with reverence. "It's still here," she whispered, touching the roots. "It just needs someone to listen." Miguel nodded and pulled off his cap. "It reminds me of my grandmother's farm in Baja. Her garden went quiet for years, then bloomed again when she turned 90. Clara stood and looked around, her eyes taking in the soil, the fence line, the gentle slope of the hill where Evelyn and Henry once planted zinnias. "We don't want to change it," she said. "We want to bring it back. Native blooms, restorative species. Nothing invasive. Nothing rushed. We want the land to breathe again." Evelyn swallowed the knot in her throat and handed Clara the folder. "This is yours now," she said. "All I ask is that you remember, this soil remembers things." Clara placed a gentle hand over Evelyn's. "We do too." She didn't tell her children until the papers were signed. It wasn't out of spite, it was out of necessity. She knew how they'd react. She had seen it in their eyes for months now, the assumption that everything she had would someday, automatically, become theirs. Not by love, but by inheritance. It was a Sunday morning when she invited them over. She baked scones. She made coffee. She laid out the good napkins. Carla was the first to arrive, phone in hand, already talking to someone about a listing. Lucas followed with the boys, distracted and visibly tired. Mason brought his laptop, assuming there would be another planning session. Evelyn sat at the head of the table and waited for them all to settle. "I wanted to let you know," she said, "that I sold the garden plot. The room went still, just long enough to register shock. "You what?" Carla said, blinking. "Sold what?" "The garden," Evelyn repeated. "The half-acre from the shed to the oak fence line. The portion your father separated years ago. It was mine legally. It still is, until next week, when it becomes Clara and Miguel Langdon's." "You can't do that," Carla snapped, standing so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "That's family land." Evelyn stirred her tea. "No, that's my land." Lucas looked stunned. Mason was already typing something into his phone. Carla's face was red now. "You didn't even tell us. We were building a plan." "You were building your plan," Evelyn said. "None of you asked about mine." Lucas finally spoke. "Mom, are you sure about this?" "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitation. "They don't want to profit from it. They want to grow things. Heal the soil. Let it bloom again." Mason scoffed. "That's great in theory, but this place could be worth a fortune if we developed." "I'm not interested in fortune," Evelyn said, her voice rising just slightly. "I was interested in being seen, in being asked, in being respected." Silence returned, heavier this time. Then Carla said, quieter but still sharp, "This is betrayal." Evelyn didn't flinch. "Betrayal is cutting down your father's hedges without asking. Betrayal is laying gravel over the roses he planted on our anniversary. Betrayal is whispering about real estate brokers while living in my house." No one responded. So Evelyn stood. She walked to the kitchen counter and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the deed, signed and stamped. She laid it gently on the table. "I gave the garden to someone who would love it," she said. "Because you didn't." And then she left them there, sitting among uneaten scones and cooling coffee, staring at a truth that no longer needed her permission. Later that evening, Evelyn stood at the fence, watching Clara and Miguel unload mulch and seed packets from the back of their truck. Miguel had brought wooden crates labeled Wildflower Mix and Fennel Root Rebuilding Series. Clara knelt by the edge of the gravel and began pulling stones aside one by one. "We're thinking of starting with columbine and bee balm," Clara called over. "Native, colorful, and good for pollinators." Evelyn smiled. "Henry would have liked that." Clara paused. "Tell me about him." So Evelyn did. She told them about the first tomato plant, about how he built the garden bench with nails too long and called it character. She told them about the porch light dances, the anniversary roses, the time they tried growing corn and got a single sad stalk. They listened like archivists, storing every word. And when she finished, Clara said, "Thank you. We'll take care of him too." Evelyn wiped her cheek with the edge of her sleeve. She didn't realize she'd been crying. Not from sadness. From relief. That night, she stood by her window with a cup of tea, watching the Langdons stake out rows with twine and bamboo poles. They moved slowly, carefully, like they were drawing on sacred ground. The stars were beginning to emerge above the pines, and the air smelled of wet earth and possibility. She reached into her drawer and pulled out the old garden map Henry had drawn years ago, yellowed and creased from being opened too many times. She smoothed it out, laid it flat, and made a small note in the corner. "Clara and Miguel, Summer 2023. The garden is safe again." The air was different that morning, lighter somehow, like the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Evelyn woke up before the sun, as always. She brewed her coffee strong and black, the way Henry liked it, and stood at the kitchen window watching the first blush of dawn stretch across the field. The swing set was still there, silhouetted against the fading stars. The gravel lot remained, but it no longer taunted her. Not anymore. The garden had been sold. The papers were signed. The boundaries were redrawn, not just in the soil, but in her soul. She took her coffee onto the porch and settled into Henry's chair. It still creaked beneath her weight, still held the curve of his shoulders. She didn't need to speak to him today. He already knew. They came that afternoon. Lucas had been quieter since the sale, sending only a few clipped messages. Mason hadn't visited at all. But Carla arrived like a thunderstorm in a silk blouse. Evelyn was kneeling in what remained of her herb bed when she heard the SUV crunch into the gravel. She didn't stand, didn't dust off her knees or force a smile. Carla walked over, her heels catching in the dirt. "Mom," she said tightly, "we need to talk." Evelyn stood slowly. "No. You need to listen." Carla blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said," Evelyn repeated, brushing her hands clean, "that you've done enough talking. It's my turn." Mason and Lucas had joined them now, standing awkwardly by the porch steps. Evelyn gestured toward the swing set and the barbecue pit and the gravel. "Do you see it now?" she asked. "What I meant all those times I asked you to slow down, to respect what was here before you started drawing up blueprints?" Lucas opened his mouth, but Evelyn held up a hand. "No, not yet. You've spoken over me for a year. Now you're going to hear what it did." She walked toward them, not confrontational, not angry, but steady, grounded, like a tree that had weathered its last storm and was still standing. "Every time I said no, you heard yes. Every time I asked for space, you brought plans. Every time I said, 'This garden means something to me,' you laughed and called it dirt." Carla shifted uncomfortably. "We were trying to help you, Mom." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Helping doesn't mean taking. Helping doesn't mean bulldozing a life you didn't build. "We thought you'd be grateful," Mason muttered. Evelyn turned to him, voice softer now. "Gratitude isn't owed when what's given was never asked for." Lucas sighed. "Why didn't you just tell us you didn't want us changing things?" "I did," Evelyn said calmly. "Many times. But you weren't listening. You were waiting for me to agree." The silence between them thickened, stretched like old rope. Then Carla said it, the sentence Evelyn knew had been waiting. "This wasn't yours alone anymore. It was family land." "No," Evelyn said, her voice firm but kind. "It was my land. The garden, my garden, was the only thing still tied to me, to your father, to something sacred. And when you took that without asking, you took something you didn't understand." Mason stepped forward. "You could have given us a chance to fix it." Evelyn cut him off. "You had the chance. Every dinner, every weekend, every quiet moment where I asked you not to. You thought I was just being sentimental. That old age meant surrender. But I was asking for dignity." Carla crossed her arms. "We're your children." "I know," Evelyn said. "And I love you. But love doesn't excuse erasure. You wanted my life to fit inside your convenience." Lucas looked away. Mason sighed. Carla's voice was barely a whisper now. "So, what happens now?" Evelyn looked at her children. Grown, successful, but still missing something essential. Not love. No, she knew they loved her. But they didn't see her. And for years, she had allowed it. That ended today. "Now," Evelyn said, "I live. In my own way. With peace. And without needing to ask permission to be who I've always been." None of them had a response. So Evelyn turned and walked back to her garden bed, knelt again beside the chives. She didn't look up when they walked back to their car. Didn't watch as the engine started and the gravel stirred. They left without saying goodbye. For the first time, Evelyn didn't feel hollow. She felt free. That evening, Clara stopped by with a basket of early bloomers, yarrow, columbine, and one stubborn root of goldenrod she'd rescued from the far side of the lot. "I thought you might want these for your kitchen beds," she said. "They like a little sun, a little defiance." Evelyn chuckled. "Just like me." They planted in silence, side by side. As the sun dipped below the hills, Clara handed Evelyn a small tin. Inside was a folded note. On it, in Clara's neat handwriting, were the words, "For the woman who remembered who she was." Later, Evelyn sat again on the porch, this time barefoot, a blanket over her knees. The moon was rising, the wind carried the scent of soil and change, and the land no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like home again. Not because it had returned to what it once was, but because she had. By early October, the first signs of Clara and Miguel's work had begun to reveal themselves, not with grandeur, but with intention. The gravel had been quietly lifted and repurposed to line walking paths. The swing set, once bolted into sacred ground, had been gently dismantled and relocated to a sunnier corner, now surrounded by child-safe blooms. The soil, dry and compacted, had been turned over by hand, every inch of it coaxed back to breathability by compost, patience, and care. They hadn't planted rows of perfect flowers. This wasn't that kind of garden. Instead, it bloomed in clusters and corners: bee balm, echinacea, goldenrod, milkweed. Plants that had once thrived in Oregon's native soil, invited back home. Clara called it restorative landscaping, but Evelyn saw it as something deeper. A resurrection. Each morning Clara walked the garden barefoot, whispering updates to Miguel and writing small labels by hand. Miguel, in turn, built trellises from fallen branches and repaired the fencing with salvaged wood. They didn't bring newness. They brought reverence. And everywhere, dangling from trellises, posts, even the old rake Evelyn had nearly tossed out, hung wind chimes. Dozens of them, each made from her old tools. A trowel, a broken watering can, even the handle from Henry's wheelbarrow. They sang softly in the breeze like echoes of past seasons, voices returning home. But the most touching transformation was near the oak tree. There, beneath its wide branches, they had cleared a perfect circle. At the center sat a weathered bench, its edges sanded and oiled but untouched otherwise. Henry's initials were still carved on one leg, slightly crooked, just as he'd done it with his penknife all those years ago. They hadn't replaced it. They'd honored it. Above it, hung on a cedar plank affixed gently to the fence, was a wooden sign carved by Miguel's hand. In honor of Evelyn and Henry Carter, for what they planted here. Evelyn returned to the garden one final time on a Saturday morning. She hadn't come to work. She hadn't even brought her gloves. This time she came just to sit. Clara and Miguel were already in the far end of the garden, tending to a patch of columbine, but when they saw her, they only waved. No words. No fanfare. She made her way slowly to the bench. She sank into it like a prayer answered. The wood creaked under her weight, familiar and solid. Around her, the wind stirred through golden grasses. A monarch butterfly flitted past her shoulder. The sun filtered through the oak leaves, casting flickering shadows across her lap. She looked around, not for what had been lost, but for what had been saved. It was all there, in new forms, but unmistakably, joyfully there. Where her rose bed had once been, now grew a sea of purple asters. The rosemary she once tucked near the shed had returned, seeded from roots no one had noticed. The herb markers, tiny wooden stakes she and Henry had once painted together, stood resurrected, their lettering faded but visible. Even the cracked path had been left in place, winding now through native plants and repurposed stonework. Not erased. Not replaced. Respected. She closed her eyes and remembered a day long ago, Henry, covered in dirt, smiling at a crooked tomato plant that had finally borne fruit after weeks of coaxing. "See," he'd said, "you never know what'll come back." Clara came and sat beside her eventually, her skirt stained at the hem from morning dew. "We didn't want to over-design it," she said quietly. "Just help it remember itself." Evelyn nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I thought it would hurt more," she finally whispered. "Coming back." Clara placed a hand on her knee. Sometimes love looks different than memory. Doesn't mean it's not still love. They sat in silence. The wind chimes sang overhead. Children's laughter echoed faintly from down the hill. A pair of bluebirds landed on the edge of a planter, pecking curiously. "I think I'm ready now," Evelyn said after a while. "To let go?" Claire asked. "No," Evelyn smiled. "To step aside." That afternoon, Evelyn walked the garden's full edge, brushing her fingertips across every petal, every post. When she reached the lavender bed, she knelt, not to plant, but to place something. From her coat pocket, she pulled a small stone, rounded, pale gray, engraved long ago with the words Henry had whispered to her so many times. "For Evelyn, my forever bloom." She pressed it gently into the soil beside the lavender and whispered, "We're home." That evening, Evelyn returned to her house. It was quieter now. Fewer voices. Fewer footsteps. But the silence wasn't hollow anymore. It was sacred. Hers. She made tea. Opened the back door. Let the wind carry the scent of soil and pine into the kitchen. On the table sat Josie's letter, still pinned under a small vase of wildflowers Clara had delivered last week. She reread it slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the page. Dear Grandma Evelyn, I miss the garden. I didn't know it was special until I saw someone take care of it like it was alive again. Thank you for letting them have it. I think that's the best kind of love, when you give it to someone who knows what to do with it. I'm going to plant things too someday. Maybe I'll start with basil. Love, Josie. Evelyn smiled. Then she stood and placed the letter beside a photo of Henry. Not to frame it, just to let him see. They say the heart remembers what the mind forgets. Evelyn had spent months grieving a space, a legacy, a silence. But she now understood something deeper, that legacies are not bound by ownership. They are measured in hands that carry on what you once loved, in seeds passed down like stories, in the soil that remembers even after your footsteps are gone. The garden was no longer hers. And that was what made it beautiful again. She had saved it, not by clinging to it, but by knowing when to let it live on. In new hands, with new roots, but always with the same heart. Evelyn Carter stood at the garden gate one last time. The wind had changed. It was cooler now, carrying the scent of turning leaves and distant rain. The kind of wind that whispered, "You've done what you needed to do. You can rest now." The land was no longer hers, not by deed, not by duty. And yet, in every corner, her presence still lingered. It lived in the lavender that had bloomed again, wild and fragrant. It hummed in the wind chimes that Clara had made from her old gardening tools. It waited in the worn bench where Henry's initials still rested, etched by hands now long gone. She hadn't come to linger, just to say goodbye. She walked slowly, her fingers brushing over petals and stems, each plant offering a kind of thank you. The golden yarrow bowed gently in the breeze. The bee balm stood upright and proud. Even the once damaged path, now mended with love, seemed to nod beneath her feet. She paused beneath the oak tree. That tree had witnessed it all, her planting, her grieving, her quiet defiance, and finally, her decision to choose peace over possession. To choose life not as it was, but as it could be. It had taken her most of a lifetime to understand something that now seemed so obvious. Love isn't ownership. It isn't found in whose name appears on a deed or who holds the keys. It's in what you build together. And more importantly, in what you're willing to let go of, so it can grow again, in hands that will honor it. Evelyn had fought for years to preserve what she and Henry had created. She had watered soil no one else remembered, pruned roses that others called just plants, defended silence when her voice was being drowned out by blueprints and budgets. She had loved fiercely, stubbornly, quietly, and that love had once made her feel powerful. But as time wore on, she began to understand that true strength wasn't found in clinging tightly. It was in knowing when to release, when to give someone else the chance to carry the beauty forward, when to choose legacy over control. There had been a time, not so long ago, when she thought surrender meant weakness. But standing there now, watching Clara guide a young volunteer through compost layering with the same reverence Evelyn once had, she saw it clearly. She hadn't lost anything. She had passed something on. And what grew from that act of courage was far more vibrant than anything she could have kept alone. Her thoughts turned to Josie, her granddaughter, and the letter she'd written, the violet pressed between the pages still resting in a frame on Evelyn's kitchen windowsill. "Thank you for letting someone else take care of it. That's the best kind of love," Josie had written. "I think I want to grow things too someday." Evelyn smiled at the memory. A single letter, sent in purple ink and bound with a child's honest clarity, had said more than 1,000 conversations. That was how love lived on. Not through inheritance, not through obligation, but through understanding, through respect, through the hands of someone who says, "I see what you built, and I will honor it." Evelyn sat one last time on her bench. The wind stirred her white hair as she leaned back and looked out over what was no longer her garden, but still her heart. The sign on the fence still read, "In honor of Evelyn and Henry Carter, for what they planted here." She didn't need more. She had planted joy. She had harvested peace. Life lesson, 200 words. What Evelyn Carter learned wasn't printed in any manual or passed down at any Sunday sermon. It lived in her bones, in her calloused fingers, and in the rows of flowers that had come and gone over the decades. Love, she realized, is not about possession. It is about presence. It's not sealed in legal papers or dictated by bloodlines. Love is what you invest in the quiet hours. It's the way you tend something others forget. It's the way you listen when the world speaks softly. And it's found most purely in the moments when you're brave enough to let go, not out of defeat, but out of hope. Sometimes, the truest expression of love is stepping aside, letting new hands tend old soil, trusting that what you nurtured will bloom again, not in your shadow, but in your honor. Real-life application, 150 words. In our own lives, we often cling to what we've built, homes, titles, routines, as proof of our value. But what if our greatest strength lies not in holding on, but in choosing when to release? Whether it's letting go of control in a family dynamic, retiring from a role we once defined ourselves by, or passing down a tradition without demanding ownership, there's profound courage in choosing peace over possession. Evelyn's story reminds us, your worth isn't in what you keep. It's in what you cultivate, protect, and finally, trust others to carry forward. The garden had long since changed hands, but Evelyn's porch remained untouched. The wicker chairs still faced the same direction, toward the eastern sky where the sun climbed slow and steady each morning. The chipped flower pot still sat on the railing, its soil bare, its potential sleeping beneath the frost. It had been 3 months since she'd last visited the new garden. Clara and Miguel kept her updated with letters and the occasional photograph, snapshots of columbines sprouting through winter soil, of children from the community learning to compost, of handwritten signs labeling native species. It filled Evelyn with warmth, not from ownership, but from a deep knowing. Something she'd built had survived. Not the exact rose. Not the roses. But the soul of it. Still, she hadn't expected to see Josie again, not this soon. It was a Saturday morning when the knock came. Unsure, Evelyn opened the screen door to find her 12-year-old granddaughter standing on the step, bundled in a coat 3 sizes too big, holding a cloth bag in both hands. Inside the bag, carefully sealed in a mason jar, was a scoop of dark, fragrant soil. Josie looked up at her with wide, tear-bright eyes. "I took it from the new garden," she said quietly. "They let me." Evelyn stepped back, gesturing to the porch swing. "Come in, sweetheart." They sat side by side, the wind weaving through the slats behind them. Evelyn poured cocoa, and they sipped in silence for a while. Josie's feet didn't quite reach the floor yet, and they swung just slightly, toes brushing the wood. "I'm sorry," Josie said finally, "for not understanding. Back then, when we stomped through your plants and called it our playground." Evelyn smiled but didn't rush to reply. She let the moment settle, the way good soil needed to rest before planting. Josie reached into the bag again and pulled out a small trowel. "I want to learn now," she said. "I want to grow something. Like you did." Evelyn placed her mug down slowly, turned to face her granddaughter, and said something she hadn't spoken aloud in months. "Then we begin by listening." Josie tilted her head. "Listening to what?" "To the dirt," Evelyn replied. "It will tell you when it's ready, when it needs water, when it's too tired. The land always speaks. Most people are just too loud to hear it." Josie nodded solemnly. "I want to be quiet enough to hear it." That afternoon, they walked to the edge of Evelyn's remaining property, a forgotten patch of earth behind the old chicken coop, where weeds had claimed dominion and an unused hose lay curled like a sleeping snake. Evelyn knelt first. Her knees protested, but her hands knew what to do. She touched the soil, pressed her fingers into its cold surface, and smiled faintly. "It's stubborn," she murmured, "but not lost." Josie mirrored her, dropping to her knees without hesitation. Evelyn handed her the trowel. "Let's give it a reason to bloom." They worked in the pale winter light, clearing rocks, adding compost, digging small rows. Josie learned to press seeds gently, to mark corners with pebbles, to whisper to the roots as they covered them. It wasn't a grand garden. It was maybe 10 feet wide. But in it lived something bigger than flowers. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn and Josie returned to the garden almost daily. They planted snap peas and calendula, lavender and lettuce. Josie made little signs out of popsicle sticks. One read, "Hope lives here." Another, "Made with Grandma's love." When spring finally arrived, the buds came early. Not in the Langdons' garden. Not in the restored fields. But here, in this small, unassuming corner behind the coop, beneath the branches of a forgotten pear tree, flowers bloomed, some wild, some deliberate. The colors were messy. The lines weren't straight. But it pulsed with life. It pulsed with meaning. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the pines, Josie turned to Evelyn and asked a question that would linger long after the flowers had faded. "Do you think love is like seeds?" Evelyn looked at her, eyes moist but smiling. "Yes," she said, "but only if you let it go." "What do you mean?" "Well," Evelyn said, brushing dirt from her palms, "you don't plant a seed and keep it in your pocket. You don't say, 'This is mine forever.' You place it in the ground. You give it space. You water it, sure, but after that you trust. You let the sun do what you can't. And it grows." "Not always," Evelyn said. "But when it does, it's not just because you wanted it to. It's because you let it." The day Josie asked to take her little garden bed home, Evelyn didn't cry. She smiled, walked her to the fence, and handed her a jar of seeds, some harvested from their recent bloom, some she'd kept for years in her drawer. "This is your beginning," she said. Josie looked up. "But will you still teach me?" Evelyn wrapped her in an embrace. "Always. But the rest, you'll have to listen for yourself." They stood there a moment longer, side by side, 2 generations with dirt on their hands and something sacred between them. Not a garden. Not a legacy. But the understanding that what we love most doesn't die when we give it away. It blooms again, somewhere new, in someone we've taught to listen. And that was how Evelyn Carter's story found its final chapter, not in the selling of land or the silence of goodbyes, but in the quiet passing of a trowel. In a garden too small to measure. In a girl just young enough to believe. And in the woman who finally, beautifully knew. She had let go. But nothing had been lost. Only planted.